Guys, I have to tell you about this new movie that's coming out. You know what it is? Let me just show you. It's called this. Get ready. Contextualization. Doesn't that just sound amazing? Doesn't this just sound like full of fun and action-packedness? In fact, it's coming to a class near you. So near that it's now. Hope you guys are doing well. I don't know what day it is that you're going to be listening to this, but I hope you're doing awesome. We talked about causation before. Let's talk about contextualization now. A lot of words, a lot of letters. All right. So firstly, before we do this, what is the purpose of using causation when studying history? Do you remember causation? Do you remember what it is? Do you remember what the purpose of using causation is when studying history? Why is it important to understand causation? Okay, we likely did that game where you had to match different things together. Like you had the shot heard around the world call from the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Okay, that was the event, but the effect was the American Revolutionary War started. So if you have a cause and you have an event and it caused something like those two things, it then brings up other questions for you to answer. Why did one shot cause the American Revolutionary War? Was it just one shot? What was it about that one shot? What is the context of that one shot? Okay, so causation brings up those other moments. So we kind of just answered it right then, but let's look at it one more thing. Does it help us understand history? If you understand causation, does it really help you understand history? Why or why not? Do you have to go deeper? Okay, and so let's take a moment, and does anybody have any answers to these questions right here? Okay, let's jump into it. Contextualize. This is what the definition to contextualize. Okay, this is from Google. I just like those little bitty fancy letter things underneath it. It looks like some futuristic language. Anyway, so to contextualize means to place or study in context. Wow, okay, to place or study in context. That doesn't give us very much. It's kind of like one of those definitions where they put the word in the definition. Okay. Down here at the bottom, you have a quote that's pretty interesting where it says, the book contextualizes Melville's short fiction and poetry. Melville is Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. And this person is saying the book contextualizes his short fiction and poetry, meaning the book gives us an idea of why Melville's short fiction and poetry is the way it is. But let's get further. Let's get further into this definition. Okay, so our objective today for this little presentation is to understand what is contextualization and how do I use it. Okay, so I'd like you to write those questions down. What is contextualization and how do I use it? Is it a tool? Is it a plane? Is it a bird? Is it a pancake? Is it a waffle? Is it a chicken? Is it a chicken and waffles? Before we get carried away, let's go to the next slide. Okay, now to start off our understanding of contextualization, let's look at this picture. Now, if you're just to look at it the way it is right now, you could probably gather it is a beach or a mountainside next to a beach, perhaps some water. Okay, and this is just a very tiny picture, but this is just one moment actually in an, we'll go to the next slide, much larger picture. Now, when you have the much larger picture, you can kind of gather what's going on here. Okay, it looks like a novelty type picture where someone's holding a frame and they get an actual photo in or an actual scene in the frame. You can see down on the beach now that there is actually a beach and there is some rocks, kind of a rock hill placed down to a beach, so there is a real beach to this place. It also looks right down upon here. I don't think you can see it. Let me mark it. There is some people down there. Okay, and so without this entire rest of the picture, I don't know why I'm circling everything right now. It looks like someone tried to do a heart, but they didn't. But anyways, without this entire picture, or if you if you just had that small picture and that's all you had to go with, you would miss everything else around it. Okay, so let's go even further. You remember that? You remember this story? We watched President Uchtdorf talk about that poem about the men from Indostan, I believe, to learning much inclined. Okay, where they all of them were blind and came up and touched the elephant and tried to figure out what it is. And they just touch a part of it, one point of it. And because they only touched one point of it, they could never understand the whole. They couldn't understand the rest of the elephant. There was more to the story. So in order to give, let's say, the trunk context, they had to understand the rest of the elephant to understand the trunk of the elephant. Okay, so let's move on. All right, so here's something interesting as far as context goes. It works a lot in the literature as well. If you take things out of context from what they're originally in, then there are big problems. Okay, so let's take the Wizard of Oz for instance. I'm going to give you one line from the Wizard of Oz, and you identify its importance, what it means, and what's the message here. Okay, so this is the line out of context right now. You don't need brains. Okay, so that's out of context. If we don't have anything else to go with, what does that mean? Well, it means just you don't need brains. We don't know who said it or why they said it or who they said it to. Okay, you don't need brains. Now, if we just take that line and that's all we had to go with, we discover that, well, someone out there thinks that we don't need brains. And we're confused a little bit by it, okay? Because we're just looking at one line without everything else behind it. Let's put it into context now. "I think you're a very bad man," said Dorothy. "Oh, no, my dear, I'm a really very good man, but I'm a very bad wizard, I must admit." "Can't you give me brains?" asked the Scarecrow. "You don't need them," and that's where our "you don't need brains" comes in. "You don't need them. You are learning something every day. A baby has brains, but it doesn't know much. Experience is the only thing that brings knowledge, and the longer you are on the earth, the more experience you are sure to get." "That may all be true," said the Scarecrow, "but I shall be very unhappy unless you give me brains." Sorry, I messed up the voices there. Okay, so this brings it a little bit more into context. We now understand, okay, there is a scarecrow, there's more people involved, there's a wizard, okay? We understand what the wizard is trying to say, perhaps, in his quotation where he says, "You don't need them," referring to you don't need brains, okay? And that he actually doesn't mean you don't need a brain, but it's all about, it's more than just having an organ, it's having the knowledge and experience that come from that, okay? So contextualizing something means looking at everything else around it. What is also happening in that moment? Okay, let's put it into context of history. Well, firstly, this is a good question to ask, okay, to help you understand context and to contextualize something. How did other events and circumstances influence the point of study? Now let's look at 2 points of study. One that you're familiar with and one that you're not familiar with, depending on what class you're in. Okay, so the first point of study is Joan of Arc. Okay, so if we take Joan of Arc's experience and we have where Michael visited her, we have her battle at Orleans, okay, where she not defeated, well, I guess you could call it a defeat, but she withstood the siege of the English there, okay? And if we take her life at this moment and we need to contextualize it, in order to understand Joan of Arc better, what sort of things do you think you need to know or would help you understand her life better in terms of what you understand what contextualizing means? So take a moment and pause there and either talk about what you know already, depending on the class, about what would give you context to Joan of Arc's life, but also what would help you know, what would you want to know to give you context of her life. Okay, the other scene is the Hongwu Emperor, okay, the rising of the Hongwu Emperor. Now, in order to give you context of the rising of the Hongwu Emperor, like we just have the event, he rose to power, the first emperor in the Ming Dynasty, what would give you context to better understand what his rise truly was or meant? Now, some of you may know of his rising and the uniqueness of it. And through understanding those unique things, that gives you context for the story. So you have to understand the context. It's extremely important. For instance, Joan of Arc. What's happening in England at the time? What's happening in France when she's born? What's happening in other portions of Europe? How is the political climate? How is the religious climate? How is the social climate? All of these things are factors that give you the context of Joan of Arc's life. It could also be influences that were upon that person and that point of study. Maybe it had nothing to do with the actual person itself, but maybe you just know like the economy of Europe was this. Therefore, because it was such and such, it would influence people in this way. Same thing with the Hongwu Emperor. Perhaps there was disease, which we know there was over in China at that time, that killed a lot of people. And based upon it killing a lot of people, people then felt these motivations to do certain things, which maybe led the Hongwu Emperor to do what he did. So contextualization is finding everything around an event that possibly could influence that event. For instance, let's take the Restoration. If we contextualized Joseph Smith going into the grove of trees, there's certain things that can contextualize this. The area he's living in, the grove he's living in, the houses he's living in, the house that he's from, his family situation financially that led them to this place, and the political climate at the time, religious freedom at the time. The people could read the Bible at the time. So we have so many different contextualizations that help us understand what is going on. Okay, let's bring it to us now. Okay, let's relate it to us. So eventually what we're doing is this 4Ring method that we talk so often about in the school, and we do often, but sometimes don't acknowledge what points are which R's. Okay, so we've researched. We're going to record. We're recording hopefully right now as well. Let's relate a little. We talked about this question before. How did you come to American heritage? But we talked about it in the terms of causation. What causes led you to come to American heritage? Let's talk about it in terms of contextualization now. What surrounding factors contributed to the choices and decisions and causes that came to your coming to American heritage? You could even go to the extent, guys, in this contextualization of going to the fact that we have cars. The fact that cars were invented is, if you put that, you're coming to American heritage and you contextualize that, cars were a factor. They're an influence in these things. They didn't cause it. They didn't cause it to come, you to come to American heritage, cars. But the fact that they are there instigates and helps you come to this school, whether it was that you moved from somewhere or you lived far enough away that if cars weren't there, you wouldn't be coming to the school, but the fact that cars are here, you are coming to the school, and so on and so forth. So contextualization is huge, and there's so many different factors we can look at. Okay, and this last part that we want to talk about here is causation versus contextualization. So what I'd like you to do is write down on your piece of paper causation, underline it, and then just a few spaces to the right, contextualization, and underline it. Would you be able to write down bullet points of what each of those are, each of those ideas means? And then once you do that, are you able to see the difference? Okay, so pause this now and let's write that down, and so we were able to see the differences here. Now, when we started this video, this little slideshow thing, we talked about our objective was what is contextualization and how do I use it? So how would you answer that question now? What is contextualization and how do I use it? Okay, and maybe you pause right then. I didn't mention that, but maybe you pause right then and maybe you discussed it a little bit. So, but let's talk about this in terms of our life, because we research things here, we reason with things, we relate with things, and we record things. Okay, and even if we don't signify, hey, we're relating and recording right now, we are doing that often. Okay, we're doing it so much so that hopefully it is something that has been instilled because of that method is so effective. So let's relate contextualization a little bit right now into our own lives. And let me kind of tell you a story about it in my life, but first let me ask you this question. Have you ever taken something out of context that someone said? Like someone has said something to you, or you heard that someone said something, but you do not know the full context behind it or the surrounding factors and influences, and because you don't know that, it might seem strange to you. Let me tell you an experience I had once. I don't remember where I was in the scriptures, but I was reading my scriptures, and I came across a passage, and I believe it was in the Book of Mormon. I came across a passage that seemed odd to me. Just the way it was written, I was like, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand it. And sometimes we come to scriptures where we don't grasp the full meaning, but this time it just seemed really odd, like just very obscure. And I'm like, what? This doesn't make sense at all. I don't get it. And what had happened is that as I looked closer at the page I was reading, there was a slight fold in the page. And when I saw that, I straightened it out, and it revealed that that fold was covering up a few words that when those words were revealed, it changed the context of the verse completely. And because of that, I then was like, oh, yeah, I understand this now. And I thought that was so funny that it was just a small fold in the page, and all I had to do was straighten it out, and then everything made a lot more sense. And it made me think, is there any folds that I have in my perception of like life or people or of the gospel or of the spirit, which, the gospel and the spirit, one and so interconnected that they are together? Are there things that have happened in my life that maybe there's a fold there, where if I just straighten out that fold, I may be able to see it in the context that it's supposed to be seen in? The context of life? Our history class is one thing we're aiming for is to put it into the context of God. Okay, you remember at the beginning of the year, we drew that timeline, and we talked about how you and I usually view things within the past like 30 or so years. Like if something happened back in the 80s and we read about that event or that thing that came out technology-wise, we can look back at it and be like, yeah, I can understand the creation and development of that because we really can understand the context more. It's really close to when we're living now. But we look back into Abraham's time. We look back into Galileo's time, back into Plato's time, back into so many different, Alexander the Great, times like that where people did certain things, and you and I often say to ourselves, why did they do that? Why did they do this when it was obviously, according to the context we have in our day and age, something that was not beneficial? But if you go back into the context of then, back in those times, and I'm not talking about things that just seemed that it was not beneficial to those people back then, but sometimes like maybe a ritual of sorts or a pattern of living that they had seems odd, but doesn't mean it's wrong. Seems odd to us. But remember, if we put it into the context of God, meaning we try and see things the way He sees them and trust that He knows all things, those things back then, such as animal sacrifices, which seems really weird to us, we put it through the context of God. It can slowly, maybe so slowly, may quickly sometimes as well, as far as quick as the Spirit is able to teach us, or rather, we are able to receive Him. We understand it, those things. It makes more sense to us because we look at it not through the context of the present day, but through the context of God who sees all things. So I want you to know there are things that will probably happen in your life that you don't understand. You don't get at this time. But as you follow God and trust in Him, He gives you context, eternal context. The gospel is amazing for that. The gospel gives context to life. So remember, as you go about contextualizing, remember the Holy Ghost is the perfect contextifier, if that's a word. And the Lord can bring context to what you need to understand. And that's what contextualization can do for us. And if we think about contextualization, we can think about it in terms of gospel things like the first vision, contextualizing the influences that happened around in the surrounding areas that led to a place, well, causation that led to an area, a country with religious freedom, and then the influences around Joseph that led him to asking Heavenly Father. Okay, contextualization is huge and very vital to understand. So hopefully we've grasped that and we can understand how can I use contextualization and what is it? Now, the next portion we'll talk about is comparison, and we'll also do continuity and change over time. Okay, so those are the next two. And then once we have a greater foundation of these 4 different concepts in history, we're going to be able to use them into a much greater effect in the portions of history that we're going to be studying. Okay, you guys are awesome. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, be awesome, be cool, be amazing, and be patriots. Okay, you guys are awesome. See you later.